this is the most perfect story, archetype type of story for this exact sort of thing. When we think about what sort of issues you could face at scale, this is like the boogeyman. This is the worst kind of thing you want to have happen.
You're listening to the AE Alignment Podcast. Every episode, a new conversation about the ideas, research, and people shaping the future of AI alignment. Let's get started. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, James Bowler, Head of Research Partnerships at AE Studio. I'm joined today by my guest, Erick Martinez, Alignment Researcher at AE Studio. Erick studied physics for his undergrad, followed by a master's in data science from Berkeley, and worked at TikTok as a data scientist before joining the AE Alignment team. Erick co-authored our gradient routing research with Anthropic, which was awarded a spotlight paper at ICML 2026. And today we are going to talk about pre-training and why we think this is a generally underexplored area of alignment research. Welcome to the podcast, Erick.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So let's start with some basics. What is pre-training and how does pre-training fit into the overall training stack for a frontier AI model?
Yeah. So what is pre-training? Well, first, I think we should talk about what are frontier AI models, right? So the frontier AI model right now, the LLM, maybe in the future that will change, but yeah, right now it's LLMs. And when we're thinking about pre-training an LLM, we're thinking really about what 99% of the training compute goes to. It's what people would typically think about when they think about training an AI model. You get a big bunch of computers, fancy computers. In our case, they're going to be like NVIDIA GPUs, and you get a big bunch of data. And then you initialize some parameters to learn how to predict the next token of the data set that you have, some huge text corpus. This is in contrast to post-training, right? So we're saying pre-training, but it really helps to understand both sides of the coin, essentially. So post-training, these are things that you would do once you already have a fully trained LLM. So with a fully trained LLM, it might be really good at predicting next token. But you could understand in a given document what the next word is going to be anywhere in that document. But if you were to, let's say, ask it a question, you could expect that the LLM might return more questions. You would typically have to tune these models in some way to get them to output the behavior you'd like. This makes it so that you can ask the model to help you accomplish tasks or ask the model questions, and it'll give you a sort of QA style format. It sort of establishes the idea of users and assistants and etc. There's all sorts of post-training. You can imagine there's different circumstances for those companies. They might want a really useful coding assistant or a very useful copy generator, like for advertisements, all sorts of applications. And that's what post-training is largely preoccupied with.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, yeah, so if I can summarize this, pre-training, where you're training on all the text on the internet to predict the next token, so you're imagining all the Wikipedia articles, all research publications, potentially social media posts, and you're trying to predict what the next word is there, and then you get to what you could call a fully trained LLM, which at least to the extent that it's a next token predictor. But then you have all of these other training steps that you need to do after that, which allow it to accomplish tasks. And there you're less focused on predicting the next token and more about how can you make it useful. And there you might bucket into, I guess some people refer to mid-training and then post-training, where mid-training is this instruction fine-tuning. So taking from a next token predictor to something that's an assistant, where you will ask it questions and it will provide answers. And then in post-training, this is reinforcement learning, where maybe you're giving it coding tasks, for example, and you're rewarding it when it kind of does well on these tasks, and that causes the weights to update such that over time it gets more and more capable of performing these tasks. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And maybe a bit more color to that is to say that the majority of compute that you have allocated for a given model will go to pre-training. And that can be very scary, right? Because you're saying, I must have this base model, which I've created from this training process, and all of this investment has gone into it. So you best not get it wrong, because once the model is essentially baked, you can only do certain interventions in post-training, but you start with the base model from there. Everything else relies downstream from creating that base model. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And so I think this is kind of part of the reason, I know I said at the start, we think that pre-training is generally neglected in terms of approaches to alignment. I think there's several reasons for that, some of which is the cost. Like you say, if you're expending most of the compute on this versus you can do explore different techniques in post-training for, a tenth or a hundredth of the cost, and it's going to be much easier to like iterate on ideas there. So there's like a cost. There's also, which we can get into in a second, a complexity involved. When you're doing pre-training at this scale, you're running compute over really large clusters. You're having to like parallelize a lot of things in order for it to, complete in a reasonable amount of time. So I guess it's like all kinds of barriers here which prevent a lot of alignment research being done in pre-training, but also it's potentially where a lot of the issues stem from, like a lot of the like emergent misalignment that we can talk about, and these different behaviors that are kind of near-term examples of what a larger problem might look like. These seem to emerge already from pre-training. So looking at post-training as a solution to fix a problem that you've already caused with pre-training is maybe like, I don't know, not solving the root cause. Do you agree with that? Anything you would add there?
100%. Yeah. And I had a lot of ideas about like pre-training and neglected approaches and how that all fits into this, right? The price, the difficulty of pre-training, a lot of it contributes to it being neglected, but it also contributes to it being like a very fertile landscape to do research in, largely because it is like cost prohibitive. So if you have an org that's willing to fund it, you can find a lot of valuable research there, but also because it's typical, right? So there are very few people who have trained very large models. So in terms of talent, it's really hard to find people who have the experience to be able to, make these sort of very expensive mistakes. There's a lot of like R&D that goes into doing the pre-training, and ideally you don't want to be making too many mistakes. So you need people who are very experienced, and it's kind of like a catch-22. So lots of opinions there. Happy to go in any direction you want here.
Cool. Yeah, it's worth saying. So there is this lack of people who have, done pre-training at scale, and most of those people are heavily concentrated inside the frontier AI companies. But you, Erick, are one of the people who has, to some extent, done this at scale outside of a frontier AI company through the research that you've been doing. So maybe you can, talk about what the pre-training work is that you have done and some of the complexities which arose, especially focused on like doing this at scale, which is something that many people just won't have had the experience doing.
Yeah. The team here at AU Studio, as in collaboration with some folks at Anthropic, are putting out a paper really pushing this idea of gradient routing. Gradient routing is this like precise framing which you can use to route gradients in the model such that you can determine based off of some data label which parts of the model will get updated on that, right? So you can imagine that the same knowledge that can be used to create novel vaccines from bioresearchers, right, interacting with AI, could also be used to synthesize bioweapons, something that as humanity, we would not like to see more of in the world. And it's a pre-training intervention that we developed over the past year or so. And through that process, we discovered so much firsthand about why pre-training is really difficult. So I kind of mentioned earlier that it's really high stakes, right? So like you only have one shot to really bake this really expensive model that you've put all this effort into. You've determined a compute budget, you've determined a specific data set, and then you train it. And if you have one shot, you can imagine that there is a lot of possibility for mistakes, right? Like you can imagine that you use a given data set and it doesn't really work out in producing the capability that you were intending the data set to produce. Lots of different potential pitfalls here. But that's one reason why I just firsthand gained a lot of experience with pre-training, because you start to understand exactly where the potential pitfalls are down the road, and you can avoid them so you don't, crash the whole big project.
Cool. Yeah, no, totally. Yeah, it'd be great to just like backtrack through some of these things. So let's talk about when we say gradient, what do we mean there? I think we're talking about some kind of reward signal that's coming from pre-training, right? Yeah, maybe you can describe the reward function that you're using during pre-training and how that creates gradients, and then what you mean by batching. So this idea of we don't just like immediately kind of update the model on every single token immediately. We kind of batch these together in order to make updates. So maybe you can talk a bit about that process.
So first, when we're training these models, we're typically training them with a specific goal in mind. For frontier LLMs, for the base model, the goal is simply predict the next token in a sequence. And how we do that is simply we assign a given loss to the correct token. And it's the lowest amount of loss if you guess the correct token that's supposed to fill the slot. And so you can add up over a given sequence all the loss that's associated with those tokens. And then if you have high loss, right, then that produces a gradient, which will then go through and backprop through the network to sort of correct the weights. So in a given network, you have all these different numbers, the different weights that ended up producing a given token. I went to the store, right? I went to the market. Let's say store is the correct answer here. So market might have a higher loss than store, right? And then so you get that high loss and you correct bits of the network. You tweak it slightly with these gradients to be able to have the model produce the word store at the end as opposed to the word market, right? And then you do this, trillions of times, and eventually you get an LLM that can do coding and math and all this crazy stuff.
So I guess you start off with, when you're doing pre-training, with a kind of randomly initialized model and you're giving it like sentences to complete, like the example that you said, like maybe you want to be the cat sat on the blank, and you let the model attempt that. Maybe it says the cat sat on the train. I don't know. And then the right answer might be Matt. And so then you have a way of translating these tokens. Let's say train and Matt are both one token. You can translate both of those tokens into a vector, and then you can compute the loss by looking at the kind of difference between those two vectors, essentially. And that creates your loss. And then the difference between those things is backpropagated through the network, so that the next time it's more likely to say Matt and it's less likely to say train, essentially.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And one thing to maybe highlight here is that if you're more wrong, the gradient will be stronger, right? So if instead of train, you said, I don't know, guitar. Cats don't sit on guitars. That'd be very strange for you to say. Then the error would be higher than, let's say, sofa. Right? Because cats do sit on sofas. And so that would be like less loss in that way, which would produce less severe gradient. A gradient, sort of the signals telling the model you're doing good or you're doing bad. Right. Yeah.
Right. So, okay. So we're creating all of these like gradients by essentially fixing errors from the model and making it better and better at kind of predicting the next token. So how does batches come into, like, how do we batch together these different gradients?
Right. So you can imagine that for a huge data set, you wouldn't want to go one at a time. It might take a really long time to go through one at a time, cat, train, guitar, etc. So you'd want to go through a lot at once and then average everything together so that it gets a big sweeping change at once. And then you do the same thing again and again and again. And that is what is meant by batching, right? You're simply creating a big chunk of updates, which you process in parallel, and then your throughput in terms of training is much faster. And you're able to train models faster this way. Yeah.
Cool. I guess, so when it comes to gradient routing, you're not only having to batch these different gradient updates, but you're also having to track, well, which of the individual updates need to be routed to which part of the model. It's not as simple as just saying, okay, we're going to take this like enormous set of batches that will cover all of the different capability. Maybe like, you have some updates that are associated with the like bio side, and you have some updates that are associated with just kind of like regular text, and you need to be careful to track those separately so that you're not conflating like gradients and having this like leakage that you're talking about, where you have this gradient update is related to bio and I'm going to update it by accident into the...
Exactly. That's exactly right. And with gradient routing specifically, you find yourself kind of in this impasse, right? You're kind of like pressured from both sides. On one side, you want to be really specific about which parameters get updated. And so we have this structure in the paper where we say, what's the data we're using? What parts of the model are we using to produce a guess? And then which parts of the model are going to get feedback based on their guess, right? Simple as that. And then we need to be really specific. You can see we're specifying the data label, the parameters we use for the forward pass, right? So the guess, and then the parameters that we think should be updated, the backward pass, right? However, if you do one at a time, you get the specificity, but you lose, on the other hand, the parallelization. If you don't do it all at once, then it'll take you forever to train the model. And ideally, we'd like to be able to iterate quickly as we're doing research, right? We'd also like to be able to have this be a technique that labs can use and not have to suffer some sort of huge throughput penalty, right? So it involves a bit of engineering to understand, okay, when we do have a big batch, how do we determine what goes where and make sure that there aren't going to be any unintended consequences as a result of getting this additional efficiency? That requires a bit of engineering work, right? Yeah.
Cool. And then the engineering work, like what level of the stack are you operating? I guess you could go, you hear about the frontier AI companies writing bespoke kernels for like particular types of matrix operation. Do you need to go down to that level, or are you kind of like in PyTorch? Whereabouts in the stack do you have to operate in as an engineer here?
Yeah, it's honestly somewhere between like writing like custom PyTorch and like writing bespoke kernels. Yeah, we never go too deep. We're not writing a custom kernel, but we are using modifications on PyTorch to be able to get control over how the gradient graph gets built, essentially, which parts of the model are going to be receiving certain parts of the gradient. But it is deeper than most sort of implementations at post-training, for instance. Post-training, you wouldn't really have to worry about any of this. You'd really just kind of like adapt the model you've already been handed.
Okay, great. So I think this is a good picture overall of like the complexity of pre-training, both for like any pre-training techniques because of the data and the compute and the parallelism involved. But then as soon as you start doing different pre-training techniques, you need like a lot more of this engineering that's at this kind of lower level that folks don't normally operate at. So I think that really like is a good motivation for why this is hard. Maybe we can talk a bit more about why we think pre-training is neglected. So I know there's examples of phenomena like emergent misalignment, which comes from fine-tuning a model where you can already see this misaligned behavior happening from a base model. Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about that and try and motivate like why we think that the root cause of some of the misaligned behavior comes from pre-training.
Yeah. So why is pre-training neglected? I mean, there's lots of things. Starting first on maybe like your approach to emergent misalignment. The result from emergent misalignment was a fine-tuning result, right? So they fine-tuned a model that was already pre-trained to be able to produce an insecure code, and they saw broad misalignment. You train it to make bad code. It also wants to like do evil things. This is very surprising, right? Because it was never trained to do those evil things, and yet it elicited that behavior. And so the idea is that somehow in the model, this was sort of baked in. The persona of like doing wrong things is baked into the model on a deeper level, probably during pre-training. Now, the question is like, is it all coming from pre-training? Can you solve this by just solving pre-training? There's a bit like of contention there. But the idea, I think, is that pre-training determines the span of possible personas and that can exist in the given model. And post-training, like how it was done with fine-tuning in emergent misalignment, can help elicit some of these different varieties of the model that exists within it, right? This is something we already see in post-training, like with assistant fine-tuning, right? So when you post-train the assistant to do instruction tuning, right? So it can answer your questions easily. Maybe somewhere deep in the pre-training process, there are Q&A data sets. So it's not so hard for the model to learn how to do this, and it can perform it quite well in a variety of different circumstances, even more general than what it was specifically fine-tuned for. And, that can be another sort of like idea that, okay, you get broad knowledge from pre-training and you can elicit different parts of it in post-training.
Totally. And it would be great if you could give a sense of scale, like how many on the data side, like how many gigabytes of data, for example, is in the training, in the training corpus here? How big are the models that you've been pre-training, and how does that compare to like a frontier size model, for example?
Totally. Yeah. So for the project, we really wanted to be able to deliver something that researchers at the frontier are familiar with. And one convention that is really common is that for a given parameter size of a model, right? So a fairly small model might be a few millions of parameters. To match the performance that is optimal for every bit of data that you have to train that model at that given size, there's this thing called a chinchilla scaling law, where for every parameter, you want like a certain amount of tokens, right? And there's a pretty consistent ratio that stays constant as you scale, where you want about 20 times the tokens as you have parameters. And that seems to scale optimally. Of course, you can always get additional performance by throwing in additional tokens. And frontier labs do this all the time. The models that you would interact with, if your frontier lab, are overtrained often. But the efficiency per token is maximized at that 20 scale. So for a 20 million parameter model, you could expect 400 million tokens to be feeding into that model to be able to be chinchilla optimal. And so we do this in the paper. And so we do a scaling between 50 million parameter models up to 5 billion parameter models. And then we do equivalent data set sizes along that scale, right? So we're chinchilla optimal throughout. And so that means that for 50 million parameter model, you'll do 50 times 20, and that's how many tokens you'd have for a data set. And then for a 5 billion parameter model, you'll do 5 billion times 20. So is that like 100 billion tokens? So you can imagine this is a huge data corpus. And part of the difficulty that comes with this is ensuring that you can find a data set that can grow with the scale of the model you'd like to generate. It has to be good quality, right? So you don't want to throw junk into your model. There's this famous sort of phrase in ML where you say junk in, junk out, right? Whatever you train the model with is what we can expect in terms of the quality that the model will output when you want it to actually make predictions on whatever you trained it to do. And so having a really curated data set is really important. However, you can imagine that as you scale to larger and larger scales, it becomes harder to curate such a strong data set. You'll need, however many people to review the data set. As the data set gets bigger, it's harder to review every single bit of it, right? Luckily, there's some data sets out there that already exist for the scale that we're covering here, right? So 50 million to 5 billion. But this is still like a huge amount of data.
Okay, yeah. So you're training a 5 billion parameter model, and the chinchilla scaling says that it's like 20 to 1 in terms of tokens. So you need 100 billion tokens. So let's say token is like roughly 3 characters. I'm trying to think like what's the number of possible characters that you could have here? Is it going to be like ballpark like 100? I mean, you have like the alphabet and you have all these other symbols. It depends if you're like multilingual. Okay, let's say 100 for easy math.
Okay, sure, it'll be 100, yeah.
So one token has 3 slots, which can each be like 100. So you need to encode one slot it's going to be how many bytes? So byte is like 8 bits. So it's like 2 to the 8, which is, what's that? 256. Okay, 256. Yeah, okay, roughly 1 byte is like one token, right? There's 256 options you can encode in a byte. Okay. Does this sound right so far?
Sure.
So got to check me here. I'm gonna do the napkin math, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong. Okay.
Right. I have Claude crunching it as I hear you suffer. So
yeah, I'm gonna have a go, and then Claude can tell me where I'm wrong. So let's say roughly 1 byte per token. So for 100 billion, that's like 100 million kilobytes, or like 100,000 megabytes, or
100,000 megabytes,
100 gigabytes. So it's like 100 gigabytes of input to make the model. Does that check out?
Are you doing 5B?
Yeah.
Yeah. Close, actually. You're in the right order of magnitude, which I find very impressive, actually. Yeah, 200 gigabytes is what it was on disk for the tokens. Yeah, the training corpus. So pretty good, I'd say.
Nice. Okay, and what was the training corpus that you used? Like, how did you source this 200 gigabytes worth of tokens?
Yeah, so we really try to match like a realistic data mixture that might be used for frontier labs. And so, there's a bunch of like research out there telling you like, how Llama was put together, which is the model from NetApp. But we use like 88% of the training corpus is this data set called FineWeb, which is basically just a big collection of a bunch of web text that exists online. FineWeb because it is like the most finely curated parts of the web. I'm sure there's lots of opinions on that, but it's really good for training models. Okay, so you have FineWeb, and then you have lots of data that's coming from other places on the internet and just like general capability-based training data. So this would be things like coding, right? Like models, we'd like them to be really good at coding. So we'll put a bunch of like coding data that comes in from this data set called the stack. So the stack is just like this training corpus of a bunch of different coding languages, right? So there's that. There's also archive. So archive, where all these papers are published in terms of like, from subjects ranging from biology to nuclear science research to philosophy, it's all there. So we go on there and we pull a bunch of data specifically about like academic writing. The reason why we do this is because for the dual use technique that we use in the paper, we sort of pull out certain subjects. So there's this programming language called Lisp. Some sort of like older programmers might recognize it as like such a beautiful language. But yeah, we pull that out and see if it can accurately predict lists when it's pulled out versus when we have it in. Similarly, you might want to pull out like a given subject, like biology or philosophy, cybersecurity, whatever. And so this is why we kind of put the data set together in this way. It's realistic to how frontier labs train their models. They want them to be good at coding, so of course they put a lot of coding data in there. But also we can use it to sort of like cherry pick out subjects and see what happens in the model when we do pluck that out from the data set and filter it in such a way that we can see some sort of performance difference. Yeah.
Cool. So there's the data side, which is, okay, that's tricky because if you're going to do something at scale, then you need this like huge corpus of data. Then the model parameter size, I guess, is the next piece. So if you're training a model of this size, then you need to have some pretty sophisticated hardware or like a cluster of hardware, which you can hold all of the relevant memory over. So maybe you can talk about that part. So we have the data sorted.
Yeah.
But when you're actually like running these algorithms, you need to be able to manage both the compute and the memory side of it. So what does that look like?
Yeah, totally. So this is one of the more limiting factors, I guess, like more immediately limiting. Like if I want to go train a big model right now, I could probably find data online. There's plenty of big data sets. Yeah, they won't produce a great model, right? If it's not expertly curated, but I will immediately run into a wall where if I want to train, trillion parameter model, the difficulty is going to be that all the parameters that make up that model, right, are huge. And they all need to be in working memory on a given GPU so that those weights, those parameters can get updated as you train. If you don't have it on the actual hardware, right? If you, let's say, had it on like a hard drive, it would take, years longer, just an absurd amount of time to be able to train anything. So it's impossible. The real novel benefit of having this bespoke hardware to train models like GPUs, all this stuff, NVIDIA that you hear about, it's related to the fact that you really want to have a high working memory on the machine, on the computer itself, right? So for a lot of the chips that we work with, so like H100, H200, they'll be on the order of some of the sizes of these models. So for instance, 5 billion parameter model, how big is that? It's 80 gigabytes of just like the actual state of the model, right? All the parameters, the weights, etc. Now there's some maybe additional gigabytes associated with like other parts of the model, but overall 80 gigabytes is like the lower limit for what you need for 5 billion parameters. Now look at an H100. I think you have like 80 some odd gigabytes of space. And so it might barely fit there. It might not if you have to store any data or, if there's different mixed precision with the optimizer state, then, forget about it. You won't be able to fit it. And so immediately, the first wall you hit when you need to train a big model is, will it fit on the card that I want to train it on? And if not, then you might need a different card, or you might need to do some like smart hacks that lots of smart people over time have created in order to fit increasingly larger models on hardware that immediately does not support them.
Right. Yeah. So I immediately, I'm like, okay, so we're training at 5 billion scale, which for pre-training outside of a frontier AI company is huge. But if you look at a true frontier model these days, it's like in the trillions of parameters.
Yeah.
And
probably.
so,
yeah.
Sure, I guess it's not like totally known, but speculative.
We don't know. Yeah.
Let's say trillions of parameters. And so if I were to extrapolate that linearly to get a 5 trillion parameter model, you'd need like 80,000 gigabytes of working memory, which I'm pretty sure is like, at that point, there's no single piece of hardware. So you have to now split this across like multiple machines. Yeah, I'm curious, what's the largest working memory on like a, I guess a Blackwell, maybe it's like a B200 GPU?
Yeah. So you can imagine that, let's say I'm at a lab and we've got a B100 chip, right? The largest possible model that I could train on that B100, if I only have that single GPU, is a model which fits on 192 gigabytes. So that's the upper limit there. Without fancy tricks and additional, like sharding, data parallelization, all this other stuff, that's your limit, right? Even if you have a bunch of data, the smartest talent in the world, if you only have a B200, and a B200 is an amazing piece of hardware, I guess I should say first.
Yeah, a B200 will set you back like in the tens of thousands of dollars, I think, right?
Yes.
Maybe even $100,000 these days.
No, I mean, an H100 right now, I think is like $30,000. So, and that's like that's all, there's newer chips now, right? So it's crazy to think about some of this hardware, but it makes sense, right? Because if you have if you have the people, you have the data set out there, you've done all this work, and then the last wall you're going to hit is the fact that your chip is like too small, then as a company, you're going to pay hand over fist to try to get the latest and greatest chip to train the more powerful model. You already are basically guaranteed to get a better, more capable model based on the scaling laws, right? So it just makes sense to dish out the funds for that. But hopefully that kind of like paints a picture in terms of like the different levers which kind of limit the size of a model you could possibly train.
Cool. And so the conclusion you get to is you need to parallelize across this hardware. And so what does that look like? Like, why is this not trivial? Why is it hard to parallelize the training and potentially the inference across these different pieces of hardware?
Yeah. So there's been a lot of smart people working on all this stuff for a long time because, you reach the end of a given GPU's DRAM and you're like, well, I want to train a bigger model anyway. I have two of these GPUs maybe, right? I have one over here that's like 80 gigabytes and another that's 80 gigabytes. Why can't I just train a 160 gigabyte model, somewhere between these two? Seems like a very obvious question. And so people have like really pushed forward to try to train these models, one, faster, right? Because if you try to train a single GPU, it might take, years compared to weeks or months, which, matters a lot for industry. But two, in the case of sharding, right? So where you're splitting up the model between different GPUs, then you can really fit a model that originally wouldn't fit on a single card between two different cards. These architectural decisions in the training process have consequences with which you have to like grapple with, especially if you have new tools you're inventing in pre-training itself. These are like hurdles you have to clear, but it makes pre-training possible. This is also, I think, a reason why pre-training has been not as like selected for, I'd say, when it comes to AI alignment research, because if you have to clear all these hurdles just to get a model trained, it seems like a minefield to clear on top of doing the very difficult thing of AI alignment research, right? Like it's like trying to align a model in a war zone, right? Because you try to incorporate one intervention and then you don't realize that, oh, well, I've used FDSP, so now I can't actually do gradient routing without, some substantial engineering work to determine how to make these two things compatible with one another. Pre-training is tough in that way because sometimes your intervention in pre-training can be really close to some of the like low-level engineering that is necessary to simply train these models in the first place. When we're routing gradients and when we're thinking about sharding, it's adding extra complexity to think, okay, here's a gradient on bio, but my bio network is actually on this GPU and this other GPU far away from it. How do I keep track of like where the gradient should flow? Will it matter if I, flow the gradients in a different order? Turns out it does, so there's all these complexities, as you can imagine. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So to recap, you have the data problem. If you need like a curated data set that's like for a 5 billion parameter model, like 100 or 200 gigabytes. And then in order to train a model that's 5 billion parameters, you essentially need to start thinking about parallelizing the training across multiple pieces of hardware because of the memory, like the working memory constraint. Well, really in order to do that in the first place. But then additionally, when you start talking about alignment techniques, where you're doing things like managing the gradients, then you need to work your way down the kind of lower level of the computing stack to get closer to the hardware, because you need to manage more carefully like where the gradients are being routed in terms of the physical hardware that's storing the weights where the gradient needs to be applied to. Is that right?
Exactly. And specifically in our use case, right, with gradient routing, we really wanted to keep certain parameters essentially like isolated from others, right? And so you can imagine that if you have a little bit of gradient leak into something else, it could learn something that you didn't intend for it to learn. And these sort of errors are pretty quiet in terms of like how they propagate through the network. You can have a part of the model learn whatever unit as you want. Neural nets are sort of like general function estimators. And so they'll learn whatever you want it to, whatever you train it to learn. And so you can have runs that will quietly degrade over the course of a very extensive training run. And you only find out at the very end, my thousands of dollars of spend was actually a waste because I had a leak. Like you could see how this is a scary prospect. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Are there any other like specific complexities that you encountered, but you think it'd be interesting to share when you were working on the gradient routing project?
Yeah. I think there's the one about gradient accumulation, which we've talked about internally a little bit. I think this is like the most like perfect like story, like archetype type of story for this exact sort of thing. When we think about like what sort of issues you could face at scale, this is like, this is the boogeyman. This is the worst kind of thing you want to have happen. And so it's a perfect story. I'd be happy to go through it.
Cool. Yeah. Let's get into it. What is gradient accumulation and why is it particularly an acute problem here?
Yeah. So the textbook like idea of gradient accumulation is that it's a free memory trick, right? If you have to have your model distributed on different GPUs, you might get a little bit of gradient from this one, a little bit from gradient from this one, and you want to be able to like sum all those micro batches up and then distribute them to a given model, right? So that instead of having one big batch, you have these like micro batches distributed, and then you can apply one big sweeping change to the model and then continue on, right? This is super useful for distributed training runs. And originally, when gradient accumulation came out, it was a really big deal because it was supposed to be mathematically identical to the big batch, right? You do these micro batches and it's supposed to be the same as the big batch. Awesome, right? The issue is that the idea of them being identical, right? A big batch to these micro batches from gradient accumulation, it rests on a couple assumptions. So if, like the lengths of a given sequence vary, then that can cause issues with your micro batches, right? Because you're not normalizing for the length of the gradients, etc. There's a lot of other things, like you can have floating point errors, right? In like a given precision, maybe like 32, it's high precision. You won't see an error, but then you round to 16, floating point 16, and you might see some of those errors. If you have one GPU doing 32, another one doing 16, maybe because, you're trying to be maximally efficient in some other way, that will accumulate in a way that you might not expect. There might be gradient clipping that is not expected, and then that can cause issues downstream, right? So there's all these like little assumptions where if you make them, then yeah, you're fine. It'll be exactly identical. But if you can't make some of these assumptions, then you're in uncharted territory. And specifically with gradient routing and the method that we were creating, it breaks one of the core assumptions. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Anything else that you want to say about pre-training, why it's hard, why we think that, we would like to see more people doing research in this area from an alignment perspective?
Yeah. I think pre-training is largely neglected because there's an incentive gradient for post-training that's much stronger. Post-training, you can do a post-training paper really cheaply, really quickly. So you could take like a baked model that someone's already created and published and then, toy with it, mess with it for relatively cheap, right? Because you're only doing inference. You're not doing that training to create that model, that 99% of the compute that's necessary to produce a model like ChatGPT or Claude. That's already done. It's baked, right? So you can do different things on top of it to really find out more about how these models work and then publish a paper based off of that. Additionally, it's very expensive, right? If you want to do pre-training research, not that many people have experience doing it, and it's really expensive if you mess up. So just for those reasons, there's like a signal pushing folks to be doing more post-training research, to be publishing more post-training papers. I would argue though that is also a benefit for researchers. If you're a researcher and you want to publish like a strong paper about something that hasn't been talked about very much, there's a lot of ripe things to tackle in pre-training because it has fewer people that can actually run real pre-training experiments, and it's largely compute limited. Of course, difficult in that like you need to find someone who's going to fund this research. But here at AE, we are particular about dedicating ourselves to neglected approaches. And so far, especially with gradient routing, we've found that it's paid off strongly. So if that's any sort of signal to update someone's priors out there about doing more neglected approaches research, I think it's a good one. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, Erick. If folks want to learn more about the work that we do at AE, you should go to ae.studio/alignment. And also, we are hiring. Check out the open roles on our website. We're trying to hire several ML engineers to support our alignment research and consulting work. If you have questions or have ideas for commercial applications of AI alignment, or approaches to the research that we have not yet been pursuing, email us at alignment@ae.studio. Thanks for listening. That's it for this episode of the AE Alignment Podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, subscribe wherever you listen and share it with a friend. You can learn more about our work at ae.studio. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.